The primary issue with hype is it's driven by narrative over reality, and it makes evaluating people, players, much more difficult. So, let's talk about it. Welcome to Outsider Information. I am your host, Brandon, and your strategic partner here with OIAS. As always, if anything resonates, like, subscribe, engage here, other social media, dealer's choice. Oh, the website. Check out the website as well. Drink of the episode is, unfortunately, a green tea chai. I say unfortunately because it is awful, and it is awful because of the ingredients behind it. That, my friends, is the lesson here. If you are going to drink a tea that is heavily reliant on herbs and spices, make sure that they use herbs and spices and don't sub out oils, flavored oils, to mimic those flavors. You are going to get a terrible aftertaste and a product that you are just going to dump out into the sink after this episode is done. So there's that. Story time. We are talking about evaluations, and not only was that something that I built my thesis around, and I'm going to follow that up with something later in this episode, but it is something that I actively do for organizations that I partner with, one of which is a local sports club. I've been with them since about January, helping out just kind of as an outsider information, and helping them with a few special projects, one of which was end of season evaluations and also tryouts as they get things situated. So what did that look like? Well, I do evaluations really one way. I try to be objective and I try to be pragmatic. When you are doing an evaluation, you are trying to connect the dots, right? In an interview sense, you're trying to see how much of the resume matches the person. When you're doing it in an athletic sense, you are trying to make sure that the tape matches what you are seeing and that you are projecting that going forward. When I do evaluations, they can come across as harsh, but you have to really understand the methodology behind it. So in this instance, we're grading out teenagers, right? And I did everything from what we saw during the season and ultimately what was going to be the result of their careers. Again, a projection, right? You can never really say what someone is going to be. You just have to make assumptions based off of the information that you have. And it was viewed by some as the standard and viewed by others as an overly harsh way to critique people. But the difference in how I try to evaluate and how we should all evaluate is it's never personal, right? If you are bringing personal gripes into an evaluation, that is going to cloud your judgment, right? You have to remove the emotion from it and you have to look purely at the results and ultimately what those results can mean. An example within that. So there was a player, pretty good upside, right? Did a lot of things well, but did what I said just was a lot of goofy crap. And I didn't say crap. My projection for this player was they're either going to be playing in college or they're going to be cut before their senior year, right? And with a player like that, coaches tend to really convince themselves that they can coach something out of them because there's upside. That lotto ticket cashed this year. They were cut their junior year of high school, and when I found that out, it wasn't so much validation of what I said, but it's proof that objective analysis, when you are trying to put together the full picture, actually does have some merit. And that is what I think in sports we do pretty well, even though the emotional side of things does tend to seep in and can at times impact the player who is ultimately the victim of the hype. So this is part case study and part regular podcast, and we are talking hype reality development. And we are going to be using 5-star quarterbacks and first-round draft picks kind of as the example in the NFL and in college sports. So the important thing to remember here is that a ranking, a projection, they're really hypothetical. There is no true way to predict production. There are indicators that you can look at, but those indicators are both independent and dependent variables depending on where they land on the scale. This is why I believe that you should have a philosophical framework for how you evaluate different people, because that ultimately is going to be the thing that makes things easier for you when it comes down time to make a decision. But those indicators are also what creates the term bust, right? We've heard of a player who was a draft bust, happens at every single level. right? And a bust is a player that doesn't live up to the hype or the projection. And I don't like the term, right? The only time I would use the word bust is if it is something that the player controlled, right? Off the field issues or something that is a clear flaw in their framework that falls outside of general development. Because usually when a player fails to meet their potential, more often than not really their fault. And you can look at that in really any organizational context. The most talented people a lot of the times fail because the infrastructure around them is broken. There are levels to everything, right? And as we elevate through our careers, as players elevate through the higher ranks, you sometimes hit your ceiling, right? You just didn't know that that's what your ceiling was, right? You have to scale up from going from a freshman team to varsity, varsity to college, and certainly college to pro. Sometimes your ceiling is just a little bit lower than what the projection was, and that can be a misevaluation, but a lot of times it's because the development just isn't there to help that player achieve what they were projected to. We also have to remember we're dealing with human beings, and in the sports sense where we're looking at, we're dealing with a lot of kids, right? We're dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds in these instances, and it's very tough to know what somebody will be for their career at that age. All right. Data and information. So here's the case study part. So I started with 2015 and I looked through the present at all the 5-star quarterbacks, and I found roughly 35 that were graded out as 5 stars, and this was through 24/7's database. Between 2015 and 2021, so 2021 was the last class of quarterbacks where we now have them in the NFL, so that is why I cut it off there. 19 total quarterbacks. Of those 19, 15 are currently or made it or are currently in the NFL, 9 of which were first-round picks. 12 of them played for 2 or more college teams, and there is certainly a line there because post-2021 is when the transfer portal rules heavily relaxed. But even before 2021, we still saw 12 quarterbacks of those 19 play for 2 or more different teams. So before we keep going there, why is that important? So the big difference that we see now is that players are changing teams a lot more free. Before this, there was a real penalty that players had to pay in order to transfer. And a lot of times it was based off NCAA rule, but there were also some conference rules that were significantly stricter. So transferring really had to have some merit behind it. And when a player transferred, there are a lot of reasons, right? Think about why you change your job, right? Could it be you hit your ceiling? Sure. But a lot of times things were not fitting the way that you wanted. Maybe some promises were broken. That happens all the time in college. And a player decides, I am going to go do something different. And when you've got the ability and the talent, that doesn't just go away, right? You're going to have a market. You're going to be able to find a new spot with a team maybe that recruited you in the past, and you're going to be able to find your way onto that roster. So seeing that players, even before the transfer portal popped up, doesn't really surprise me that we saw that much movement and mobility. All right. So that's kind of where that goes. But those numbers, pretty solid. And clearly there is some merit to seeing those quarterbacks be in the NFL. Now, with only 9 first-round picks, out of, at this point, the number would be 19, but the broader number 35, that is a relatively low hit rate. You would think that because those quarterbacks do make it into the NFL, or those quarterbacks are so highly touted, that trajectory is going to continue. And that is just not how it happens. So let us move into post-2021, where there are 16 quarterbacks who are in the college football landscape. No professionals yet. The 2022 class might be the first ones to change that. 5 have played for 2 or more teams in college. So a little bit less mobility, but at the same time, these are kids who are in their first or second year at these schools. So we still kind of have to see what that looks like. So what do we read into that? It is difficult, right? Even with consensus, there are a lot of variables. And when you are talking about development and you certainly look at some of my shorts with how often coaches are moving, getting fired, that throws things into turmoil, right? When you are looking at joining a team, and when I was recruiting players for the college, one of the main questions that I would get asked is, are you going to be around? Clearly, I was not around long enough. But that is important, right? Players go to play for specific coaches in college. And when you're going to play for that specific coach, you are aligning yourself with their scheme, their philosophy. And when that changes, you then have to go find another fit or decide whether or not the place that you are going to stay at is going to be the right fit for the new coach. What it also says is development matters more than projection. And we're seeing that especially now with a quarterback like Arch Manning down in Texas, who had all the hype behind him coming into the season. And it hasn't looked great, right? It hasn't looked great. And people are now realizing that maybe there's a reason why he wasn't playing over Quinn Ewers, because Quinn Ewers was just more developed at that time. Quinn Ewers had a ton of time in college. Maybe Arch Manning just needs more time to develop. That is natural. That is supposed to be how it happens, right? Back in the day, freshmen didn't play in college, just like first-round picks, rookies, didn't play right away in the NFL. There was a process to get them to grow and adjust to the game so that you didn't have to throw them out there, and they developed bad mechanics out of panic, and their careers ultimately get ruled. That's a whole separate argument, and I have talked to that as well. So, moving on. My original thesis, when I was doing my research, wanted to look at the success rate of first-round quarterbacks in the NFL as a model for human development. I would say evaluation is harder for the NFL because of how unbalanced college is. Players can pick their teams in college, and you can stack talent in college. It's a little bit less easy now with the transfer portal and players kind of moving around, but your team picks you in the NFL. Your development at that point is at the whim of an organization. And NFL teams have repeatedly shown that they are unable to develop quarterbacks, because if they were, there wouldn't be a quarterback problem in the league. Clearly, no team has figured out, and we've got more numbers to show that. So, same time frame, 2015 through present, 36 first-round QBs were taken. Very few of them were five-star quarterbacks. All right? 19 of those 36 are starting with their original team. 34 of 36 are in the league. If we shave off 2024 and 2025, 11 of those players are starting and 26 are currently in the league. What that tells me is nobody really knows exactly what they're looking at or looking for, and there's no consensus on development. We used to have a developmental league in the NFL, which was NFL Europe, and you had some stories that came out of there. Kurt Warner, Jake Delhomme, a few others. The UFL exists right now, and why the NFL is not partnering with them to develop players better is beyond me. Like, it is truly beyond me, and I've actually got a longer form episode just kind of centered around that down the road, but for now, I just think it is malpractice. I get why they don't do it. It costs money. That's why they canceled NFL Europe, because if you are a billionaire, losing $1, losing $10 million, losing $100 million all feels the same. And as a result, there is a lack of development happening in the NFL. Now, as much as I champion sports, the shortcomings with development are ego and looking at the shiny object and thinking that it will stay healthy. That is where the emotion comes into it. Coaches convince themselves of some really crazy things, right? The joke of I can fix them, that exists no bigger than in athletics, right? You see potential, you see something. Coaches have this innate urge to discover the thing so that they can show it off and be right. And as a result, emotion can get in the way of a true evaluation and not just hinder the development of that particular player, but also hinder the development of the players around them because you invest in this one thing. I have been guilty of that in the past. It has happened, right? Coaches convince themselves of crazy things. The evaluation is usually right, though. The talent shows. People don't deny that. And that is why you see players stick around the league for a very long time who didn't live up to the hype, right? Players get second, third, fourth chances purely based off of projection alone that at some point it might click. Justin Fields is a great example with the Jets right now. And I was one who, again, I thought this could work. But I think we are starting to see the trend now that there are some real limitations. This is potentially going to be the third season that Justin Fields is the starting quarterback of a team that gets the first overall pick in the draft. At a certain point, it's not just an outlier, it's a pattern, it's officially now a trend. So that is what happens there. So what's my argument? Look at any high-profile athlete in any sport. The blame often shifts to them for coming up short. But again, you got to look at stability in an organization. You could use this same case study in any sport across any framework, and you would probably find similar results. There's a lot out of control of the players, and it really mirrors how we work. We've all heard the term trial by fire, right? Learn by getting experience on the job. But is that really the best way? I mean, when you think about it, for those who lived through a situation like that, I certainly have, and perhaps you came out of it fine, you were able to do the job. Would you want to live like that again, or would you have rather had a cleaner onboarding experience that allowed you to really learn the job, do things the right way, and not build habits out of survival? Personally, I would want that. Development in a lot of ways is like trust. It definitely takes a while to develop something properly, and it can be ruined very, very quickly, right? You can have your confidence sail. You can have things happen that hinder all of that good work that you've done just in a moment. And more often than not, as a result of that, I blame companies for employee performance because they're the ones that hired them, and they are ultimately the ones that train them. So if an employee flames out at a company, I really don't look at them. I tend to put my blame on the people who let that happen. And I've said that in a few assignments, which doesn't always get met well, but I am paid not to tell people what they do or what they want to hear, but ultimately what the results of their actions are. Careers are very easy to ruin with a bad situation. And again, oftentimes your evaluation was right. All right, you saw talent, you saw potential. You just thought that that was going to be enough to carry it on its own. And it has to be cultivated. That is the lesson here, is that when you see talent and potential, you have to develop it in a way that allows it to come out. Solutions. I always come with solutions, right? I'm in favor of a scientific method of hiring. What does that mean? Shoot me a message and we'll talk. But I do have a specific model that is for that, built from athletics. The government also uses a similar system, but can be applied to an organizational framework. Think the research that I've done, but I've applied it to a specific model. And I think it is something that not only would thrive in an organizational context, but also at the same time would allow people to make more objective decisions. It's not a sales pitch. That is just a project I've been working on. Where and how it gets deployed, TBD, right? It would be nice if we had a more wholesome way to hire people that really built itself on a true evaluation. Companies fail because they hire a lot on feels and vibes, and you really just can't do it that way. Again, removing the emotion from a process will make your process a whole lot cleaner. And while the hit rate in sports is split, there's at least a method. The development just fails, but you can see why, again, some players do ultimately stick around for the long term. All right. We're almost out of here. A projection really means nothing if you can't give someone room to hit their ceiling, right? We talk floors and we talk ceilings. Both of those things matter. And companies ruin a lot of lives because they just don't have a philosophy of how they want to build things out. There is no perfect plan, but your goal should be to give yourself and those within your ecosystem the best shot for success. So on that, as always, I cannot save the world with anything I say, but I will do my best to not make it worse, hopefully with things like this. So if anything resonates, give a like, subscribe, and engage. We will see you next time. Have a good one.